October 18, 1963. The iron gates of Terre Haute Federal Correctional Institution swung open at exactly 8:17 a.m., and Charles Edward Anderson Barry walked out carrying everything he owned in a brown paper bag. The bag contained 2 changes of clothes, a worn copy of Bartlett's familiar quotation, $17 in crumpled bills, and a letter from Leonard Chess that had arrived 3 days earlier. What Chess didn't know was that his former star had already made a decision that would reshape the music industry forever. Because waiting in a black Cadillac across the street sat the most powerful man in popular music, and he'd come with an offer that would make Chuck Berry rich beyond imagination. But Chuck had learned something in those 38 months behind bars that money couldn't buy: the difference between being owned and owning yourself. The morning air bit sharp against Chuck's face as he stepped onto the sidewalk. Indiana in October carried the smell of dying leaves and coal smoke from the nearby power plant. He'd forgotten how the outside world sounded. Cars humming past, birds calling, the distant whistle of a freight train that reminded him of the songs he'd written about going places. For 38 months, the only sounds had been steel doors, guard boots on concrete, and the low murmur of men trying to survive. Now every noise felt overwhelming, each one competing for his attention like instruments in a badly mixed recording. The man in the Cadillac stepped out, and Chuck recognized him immediately. Morris Livy, president of Roulette Records, owner of the Birdland Jazz Club, and the most connected figure in New York's music scene. Livy's reputation preceded him like the scent of expensive cologne, which Chuck noticed he wore too much of even at 8 in the morning. Word was that Livy could make careers overnight or destroy them just as quickly. He'd made millions off rock and roll, often by methods that existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal. Chuck had heard the stories during his trial, how Livy acquired publishing rights through intimidation, how artists signed contracts they didn't understand, how Roulette's books contained creative mathematics that would make the IRS dizzy. "Chuck Berry," Levy called out, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd never heard the word no stick. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, and his smile had the practiced warmth of a funeral director. "I've been waiting to have this conversation for 3 years. Chuck adjusted his grip on the paper bag and studied Levy's face. In prison you learn to read people quickly. Their intentions lived in the space between their words and their eyes. Levy's eyes were calculating, already counting profits from a conversation that hadn't started yet. Chuck had seen that look before in the Chess Records offices, in the faces of promoters who promised the world and delivered pennies. But there was something different this time. Levy needed him more than usual, and Chuck could smell that desperation underneath the expensive cologne. "Mr. Levy," Chuck said, his voice carrying the careful politeness he'd perfected over years of navigating dangerous situations. "I appreciate you making the trip, though I wonder how you knew exactly when I'd be walking out those gates." The question hung between them like smoke, and Chuck watched Levy's smile falter for just a moment. Prison had taught Chuck the value of silence, how to let uncomfortable pauses do the work that accusations couldn't. Levy recovered quickly, but not before Chuck had seen what he needed to see. This man had been tracking Chuck's release date, probably through channels that involved money changing hands. The music industry's intelligence network operated with the efficiency of a spy agency, and Chuck was valuable cargo. "Business requires preparation," Levy said, gesturing toward the Cadillac. "Shall we discuss your future somewhere more comfortable? I have coffee, Danish, and a contract that'll make you forget all about the past 3 years." But Chuck wasn't ready to get in any car just yet. He'd spent too many nights lying on a narrow prison cot, staring at ceiling pipes and thinking about how he'd ended up behind bars. The Mann Act conviction had been built on shaky ground: a 14-year-old Apache waitress named Janice Escalante, a hat-check job at his club, and a legal system that saw a successful black man as a problem to be solved. The prosecutors had painted him as a predator, the newspapers had destroyed his reputation, and the music industry had moved on without missing a beat. Berry Park, his amusement park and recording studio, had been sold to pay legal fees. His family had suffered through 38 months of whispers and judgment, all because he'd tried to give a young woman a job. The real tragedy wasn't the conviction itself, it was how quickly everyone had abandoned him. Record executives who'd counted their profits from his music suddenly couldn't return phone calls. Radio stations that had made fortunes playing Johnny B. Good and roll over Beethoven acted like Chuck Berry had never existed. Even some musicians he'd considered friends had distanced themselves, afraid that association might contaminate their own careers. Only a few had remained loyal: his wife Toddy, his family, and surprisingly, some of the young British musicians who discovered his records and refused to stop playing them. "You know what I learned in there, Mr. Levy?" Chuck said, nodding toward the prison walls. I learned that the music business operates like a plantation. The cotton gets picked, the owners get rich, and the pickers get just enough to survive. But here's what's interesting about cotton. It grows back. Every season, whether you want it to or not. Levy's laugh was nervous, too loud for the quiet morning. Chuck, you're overthinking this. The past is the past. What matters now is the future, and I'm offering you the most generous recording contract in the industry. 2 albums a year, complete creative control, $100,000 signing bonus, and royalty rates that'll make your lawyers weep with joy. The numbers were staggering. In 1963, $100,000 could buy a mansion, several cars, and enough financial security to last decades. Most musicians never saw contracts with terms like these. Chuck's previous deal with Chess Records had paid him a fraction of what his songs earned, with Leonard Chess keeping the lion's share and claiming it was industry standard. This offer represented more money than Chuck had ever imagined having, enough to rebuild everything he'd lost and more. But something in Levy's urgency made Chuck's instincts flare like alarms. Why was this man so desperate to sign him immediately? Chuck's career was in ruins, his reputation destroyed by the trial coverage. Radio stations weren't exactly demanding new Chuck Berry material. The smart business move would be to wait, let Chuck prove he could still draw audiences, then negotiate from a position of strength. Instead, Levy was offering fortune money to a musician just hours out of federal prison. That kind of desperation usually meant someone knew something that wasn't public yet. That's a generous offer, Chuck said carefully. Mind if I ask why? Last time I checked, convicted felons weren't exactly hot commodities in the record business. Levy's smile became more genuine, and Chuck realized he'd impressed the man by asking the right question. Because the British are coming, Chuck, and they're all playing your songs. The statement hit Chuck like a physical blow. During his imprisonment, letters had trickled in from England. Young musicians writing to tell him how his records had changed their lives. Names he'd never heard. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards. They wrote about learning guitar by copying his solos, about studying his lyrics like poetry, about understanding that rock and roll could be art as well as entertainment. But Chuck had assumed these were isolated fans, not representatives of something larger. The Beatles released Roll Over Beethoven last month, Levy continued, his voice gaining momentum like a train picking up speed. The Rolling Stones are covering Come On. These British groups are introducing your music to audiences who never heard it the first time around. Kids who were too young in '55 when Maybelline hit are discovering Chuck Berry now, and they're hungry for more. You're about to become relevant in a way you never were before. Chuck felt his world shifting, like standing on a ship that had just changed course. The isolation of prison had cut him off from cultural changes, leaving him to imagine how the world might look when he returned. He'd expected to find his music forgotten, his influence diminished, his career effectively over. Instead, Levy was describing a resurrection he hadn't dared hope for. Young white musicians in England, the country that had invented the blues tradition that birthed rock and roll, were embracing his songs and introducing them to new audiences. But the revelation also clarified Levy's motivations. The music executive wasn't offering charity to a fallen star. He was positioning himself to profit from an inevitable comeback. Chuck's catalog was about to become valuable again, and Levy wanted to own the rights to whatever came next. The generous contract terms weren't gifts, they were investments in future earnings that Levy expected to multiply exponentially. "So you're not rescuing Chuck Berry," Chuck said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and wariness. "You're buying stock in a company you expect to increase in value." "I'm recognizing genius," Levy replied smoothly. "And genius always finds a way to resurface. The question is whether you want to profit from your own resurrection or watch other people get rich off your work." The words stung because they contained truth. For years, Chuck had watched other musicians profit from songs he'd written, arrangements he'd created, styles he'd pioneered. Elvis Presley had built a career partly on rock and roll foundations that Chuck had laid. Pat Boone had made millions with sanitized versions of songs that black artists had originated. Even now, these British groups were learning their craft by copying Chuck Berry licks and chord progressions. The music industry had always been a machine that ground up originators and fed fortunes to imitators. But Chuck had also learned something that Levy didn't understand. Independence wasn't just about money, it was about control. In prison, surrounded by men who'd lost their freedom through bad decisions and circumstances beyond their control, Chuck had realized that external freedom meant nothing without internal autonomy. He'd rather own a small piece of something he controlled completely than a large piece of something someone else managed. "Tell me about the publishing," Chuck said. Who owns the songs? Levy's pause was microscopic, but Chuck caught it. Standard industry arrangement. Roulette owns publishing rights to any material recorded under the contract, but with your royalty percentage you'll earn more from sales than most artists make from publishing and recording combined. There it was, the trap disguised as generosity. Publishing rights were where real money lived in the music business, not just from record sales but from radio play, movie soundtracks, cover versions by other artists, and licensing fees that could generate income for decades. By signing with Roulette, Chuck would be trading long-term ownership for short-term financial security. His songs would become Levy's property, generating wealth that would flow into Roulette's coffers long after Chuck was gone. Chuck shifted the paper bag to his other arm and felt the weight of his few possessions. $17, 2 changes of clothes, a book of quotations that had sustained him through the darkest nights of his imprisonment. Not much to show for 36 years of life, but it was his. Every item in that bag belonged to him completely, with no contracts or strings attached. There was power in that ownership, even if the total value wouldn't buy a decent meal. "Mr. Levy," Chuck said slowly, "I appreciate your offer, but I've decided something during my time away. I'm never again signing a contract that makes someone else rich off my work." The music executive's face shifted through several expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally something approaching anger. "Chuck, be reasonable. You just spent 3 years in federal prison. Your career is destroyed. Radio stations won't touch you. Club owners are afraid to book you. This contract is your lifeline back to relevance." "Maybe," Chuck acknowledged. "But relevance without ownership is just a different kind of slavery. I'd rather own a small piece of my own destiny than a large piece of someone else's." Levy pulled a gold cigarette case from his jacket pocket, his movements sharp with frustration. "You're making a mistake. The music industry doesn't work the way you think it does. You need distribution, promotion, radio connections, booking agents. You can't do this alone." "I don't plan to do it alone," Chuck said, "but I plan to do it as Chuck Berry, not as Morris Levy's property." The statement hung between them like a challenge. Chuck could see Levy calculating, trying to find new angles of persuasion. The music executive was used to dealing with desperate artists, musicians so hungry for success they'd sign anything put in front of them. He wasn't prepared for someone who'd learned to value freedom more than fortune. "What if we restructured the publishing split?" Levy offered. 60-40 in Roulette's favor instead of standard terms. That's unprecedented for a new signing. Chuck almost smiled. Levy still didn't understand. This wasn't a negotiation about percentages. It was a philosophical divide about what mattered most. Chuck had spent 38 months watching men trade dignity for cigarettes, respect for protection, principles for convenience. He'd seen what happened when you gave up control of your life, even in small increments. The music industry operated on the same principles as prison. Those who controlled resources controlled everything else. "I appreciate the offer," Chuck said, "but I'm going to try something different. I'm going to see if a man can make music without selling his soul to do it." Levy stubbed out his barely smoked cigarette with more force than necessary. "This is insane. You're walking away from guaranteed financial security to chase some romantic notion about artistic independence. The world doesn't work that way, Chuck." "Maybe not," Chuck admitted, "but I spent 3 years learning that some things matter more than money, and one of them is being able to look at yourself in the mirror without seeing someone else's property." The two men stood in silence, separated by more than physical distance. Chuck could feel the weight of the decision settling into his bones, the recognition that he was choosing uncertainty over security, struggle over surrender, but he also felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of genuine freedom. Levy climbed back into his Cadillac, but before driving away, he rolled down the window. "When you change your mind, and you will, call me. The offer won't be available forever." Chuck watched the car disappear down the road, carrying with it the promise of instant wealth and renewed fame. For a moment he wondered if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. The $17 in his paper bag wouldn't last long, and he had no clear plan for rebuilding his career. But as he started walking toward the bus station, Chuck felt lighter than he had in years. What Morris Levy didn't know, what the music industry would learn over the following decades, was that Chuck Berry's decision on that October morning would prove more valuable than any contract Roulette could have offered. By choosing independence, Chuck retained ownership of his songs, his image, and his destiny. The British invasion would indeed resurrect interest in his music, but the profits would flow to Chuck Berry, not to Morris Levy's bank account. Within 2 years, Chuck would be touring internationally, commanding higher fees than ever before. The Beatles would publicly credit him as rock and roll's primary architect. The Rolling Stones would hire him as a headliner. His old songs would find new audiences, and his new songs would prove he'd lost none of his creative power during his imprisonment. But more importantly, Chuck Berry would own it all. Every royalty check, every licensing fee, every dollar generated by his music would belong to the man who'd walked out of federal prison carrying everything he owned in a brown paper bag. The decision to choose freedom over fortune on October 18, 1963 would ultimately prove to be worth millions and something far more valuable than money: the right to call his own shots in a business built on taking that right away. As Chuck waited for the bus that would carry him back to St. Louis, he opened his copy of Bartlett's familiar quotations to a page he'd marked during his darkest night in prison. The quote from Frederick Douglass had sustained him through months of doubt. "No man can put a chain about the ankle of his fellow man without at last finding the other end fastened about his own neck." Chuck smiled, closed the book, and prepared to find out what a truly free man could accomplish in the music business.